Welcome back to the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. You've probably heard it before. TikTok is hijacking your kid's brain with dopamine. But a new investigation by Christopher J. Ferguson is calling that claim what it is: addiction fiction. Despite what pop psychology and headlines suggest, there is no scientific evidence that apps like TikTok or Instagram create dopamine spikes comparable to drugs or alcohol. Yes, your brain releases dopamine when you enjoy something, but that doesn't mean that you're addicted. Neuroscientists confirm that scrolling through social media doesn't damage dopamine receptors and it doesn't rewire the brain like opioids or cocaine. So, why the panic? Ferguson says we're in a moment where everything is being labeled as an addiction, from video games to cat cuddling. One study even joked that real life friendship qualifies as a clinical addiction if you apply loose enough criteria. But there's real danger here. By blaming tech use on dopamine, we're risking ignoring actual mental health struggles that kids may be facing, like anxiety, loneliness, or stress. The bottom line: dopamine isn't the villain, and tech overuse isn't always an addiction. It may just be a symptom of something deeper. I'm joined now by the lead investigator on this story, Christopher J. Ferguson. Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today. It's a real pleasure.
So, the same criteria that's used to diagnose heroin addiction could technically label someone as being addicted to reading, exercise, playing the piano. How does this blur the line between genuine clinical addiction and simply being passionate or engaged in a hobby? By some metrics, I'm addicted to reading. So, how do we look at this in a more productive way?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem is, with the criteria that we have right now, which were developed initially for substance abuse. So there are questions like, when I feel sad or anxious, I use heroin in order to feel better. And we would recognize that's bad, right? That's a bad choice. And what people did when they developed these criteria for what we call sometimes behavioral addictions is they used the same questions. So we had this question, if I feel sad or anxious, I use heroin to feel better. Okay, we admit that's probably not a good sign. But now we're like, if I feel sad or anxious, I read books to feel better. And it's the same question. And it's being used to diagnose people with, quote unquote, addictions to other things, whether that's video games or social media or, exercise or shopping or things like that. And it's not really clear that those symptoms work in the same way as they do for heroin or cocaine or methamphetamine. And what we really want to know is if we're worried about people overdoing things like, shopping or exercise or video games or whatever it may be, is who really has a clinical problem. And with this set of questions, we just don't know. And there actually are research papers at this point that show that using these criteria, that you're not able to distinguish who has a real problem with something versus someone who really is just passionate or engaged with that thing. So it's really difficult to figure out who might really have a problem we need to address.
I mean, critics argue that the dopamine narrative oversimplifies human behavior, kind of as you were just touching on. So, what deeper concerns do you think are being ignored in this conversation? And can you also explain the importance of the fact that we're looking at this with regards to dopamine itself?
Yeah, so dopamine is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter in the brain. It's involved in a lot of different functions. How it came to be kind of associated with this whole idea of like dopamine hits and that kind of narrative is that when you take particularly stimulant drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine, those kind of like shoot up the activity of dopaminergic systems like 1,300% of what is like the normal baseline. So that's a massive increase. And that's an increase you don't see from things like video games or social media or pizza or reading a book or anything else, really. It's really very unnatural. And that does essentially long-term damage to those systems, physiological damage that is, visible, to these individuals. And that's not something we see from, again, shopping or exercise or video games or social media. So there's like a kernel of truth to the whole narrative around dopamine, but people really got misled and mistook what was actually happening, with those systems. The reality is with dopamine, the stuff that we get from, social media or shopping or exercise is very, very normal. It's very, very natural. You want this, we're supposed to feel excited about things, from time to time. You don't run out of it. You don't become addicted to things because you're experiencing it. Even if you're using something like a video game for 8 hours, it doesn't mean that you're becoming addicted to it. It's just like if your kid's having a good day with friends for 8 hours, it's exactly the same thing. They're releasing exactly the same amount of dopamine, over the same exact amount of time. It's just a normal process. And I think that this sort of narrative around dopamine has been used to give a kind of sciencey veil to these kind of moral panics around particularly technology. And I think to your question about like what is being ignored, I mean, I think a classic example are these like smartphone bans in schools. American schools have real problems, in them. They're not functioning super well. And I think schools are at this point using the sort of blame game of sort of blaming smartphones for lack of student success for some students in order to ignore real problems that's happening with the schools themselves. So it's kind of a shuffle game, it's that shell game basically, to keep the populace distracted with this thing so nobody does anything about the real problems kids are facing today.
So is this just a misuse of the term addiction, or do you see it as part of a broader cultural tendency to demonize popular trends, like your article stated with comic books in like the 1950s? Like how, like is it that, or is it just oh, we were using this word wrong?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're using the word wrong. So, I mean, we always used it kind of colloquially anyway, right? I mean, yeah, I say I'm addicted to chocolate, and I don't mean that like literally like heroin, sort of thing. So there is this kind of casual use of the word addiction. Unfortunately, that's caused a kind of a blurring with sort of like the clinical use of the term, which is mostly related specifically, again, to substance abuses like alcohol or heroin or cocaine or methamphetamine. There's really no corollary to sort of these like behavioral overuse disorders. There's no tolerance or withdrawal from shopping, or exercise or video games or anything of that sort. So absolutely, I think the way we've used this term has really confused people, quite a bit. And yeah, I mean, it essentially is used, I think, in many cases to stigmatize activities that particularly older adults don't like, So, I mean, you can go back to the 1940s and find science papers on radio addiction, So there is this kind of like generational pattern over and over of, mostly older adults, sometimes some younger adults too, but mostly older adults who are just stigmatizing whatever the kids are trying to do today. So whether that's radio or comic books or Dungeons and Dragons or rock music. Ozzy Osbourne, who just died recently, was sued at least twice for supposedly causing teens to commit suicide. For instance, and nobody thinks that about Ozzy today. He's a hero now, apparently, but now, of course, with video games and social media, we're basically seeing the same pattern. So, and we don't learn from history very well for some reason.
But so while science might not call it addiction, there still is merit to concerns about obsessive or compulsive tech behaviors like endless scrolling or getting sucked into these kind of like doom scrolls, as people call it. So what can we do to address that? Or is there just something else we need to be studying in order to address that?
Yeah, I think we have to, like, first off, like, understand that things can be like a 2 out of 10 instead of like a 9 out of 10 at times. A lot of the things I see, it's kind of funny. Like people will talk about push notifications all the time. Like, oh my God, like my phone, or my kid's phone is all these push notifications. They're getting notifications all the time. And here I stood helpless to do anything about these push notifications. And I think, you can turn those off, right? I mean, or you could just not turn them on in the first place. And most apps ask you if you want the push notifications when you actually load the app onto your phone. So it's not a mystery why you have push notifications. You asked for the push notifications when you got the app. So, I mean, I think with a lot of these things like the push notifications and whatever else, it really would help us to have some kind of media literacy to make sure, we're all kind of focused on kids, but this is true for adults too. Make sure people know that you can turn these off, or you can just decide not to turn them on in the first place. And what other things can you do? If you're doing a little bit of scrolling around, it's probably not necessarily a bad thing. With doom scrolling, people are like looking for bad news very specifically. And so you can kind of tell people like, social media, I mean, a lot of us use it for work, and that's not going to be fun necessarily, but social media generally should be fun if you're using it for entertainment. And if you're not having fun, it's okay to stop. Like you don't have to like fight every wrong person on the internet necessarily. It's not really going to be super helpful. So I think like talking to kids and adults sometimes, because we know a lot of adults don't use social media well. But talking to people about how to maximize their experience on social media, get the most from it, avoid some of the pitfalls, avoid some of the privacy issues and other dangers and that kind of stuff. I think it'd be a lot more helpful than banning it or trying to like remove phones from schools or whatever else we're trying to do.
What do you think are some of the mental health issues that are being overlooked because of the way we're using the word addiction?
Yeah, I mean the no, well, number one and number two source of kids' mental health problems are one, their families, and two, their schools. And that's the reality. So who are the people who are pushing concerns about like cell phones? Is parents and schools. They don't want to they want to have the blame on themselves. Yeah, by far and away. When you look at kids who have like serious mental health issues like suicidal depression, parents. And it's not always that the parents are abusive. I mean, sometimes that is the problem, of course. But maybe the parent themselves committed suicide, or the parent is incarcerated, or the parent has a chronic mental illness or something of that sort. So we see a lot of issues around, families being a driver of youth mental health problems. We talk a lot about teen suicide, which actually has gone down in the last couple of years. So that's some great news, and hopefully that trend continues. But middle-aged adult suicide, my generation, I'm 54, so I'm in the parent generation basically. We have far higher suicide rates than teenagers. Myself, as particularly as a white middle-aged male, is the number two group for committing suicide. A white middle-aged male has about 3 to 5 times the likelihood of killing himself than a teenage girl does, for instance. And I think we've lost track of that, about how a lot of the driving force between teens' problems is actually their parents. And the other one is schools. I mean, like, as I kind of mentioned, schools kind of stink, right now. And teens are trying to tell us this. You get these different like studies of kids, and 70-80% tell us that their schools are a toxic mixture of boring and stressful. And that's not great, and nobody's talking about banning schools, right? Even though this is a much bigger source of kids' problems. But we probably should be talking about what we can do to make schools better. And I'm not hearing a lot of great ideas. Well, I am hearing some good ideas from people that are being ignored, but I'm not hearing a lot of great ideas from policymakers or from the schools themselves, unfortunately.
So, with this casual use of the word addiction, are we undermining the seriousness of true addiction, both in how we understand and treat it, just because we're so cavalier with saying, I'm addicted to this, I'm addicted to this, and it just kind of might discredit people who are actually addicted to something that's dangerous for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to understand there is this kind of colloquial, casual use of addiction. I mean, you can't really tell people to stop saying that. They're not going to listen. You know what I mean? It's just part of the language, right now. And it's and people usually understand in that context what people mean. Although you have to be kind of careful, because sometimes kids will say, "I'm addicted to my smartphone," and then the adults will go, and they don't mean it like heroin. So there is that kind of blurring of the lines. But yeah, I mean, I think when we can recognize that people sometimes do overdo certain behaviors, and that could be smartphones or social media. It could be exercise or work or religion. There are papers on dance addiction. There are papers on fishing addiction, right? There are some people that have cat addiction, and you can Google cat hoarder and find out that I'm not lying about that. So we can recognize that there are some people that overdo things, and that probably is an internal problem for them. There's probably something else psychologically going on. It has nothing to do with the technology or the cats or the exercise or whatever it is they're overdoing. And it really is that they themselves have some psychological problems. That doesn't mean we should ignore it. That overuse can still be a symptom, a red flag, if you will, that they may have some other issues that are going on. But I think this idea that we have this narrative that like using your smartphone is the same thing as like heroin is absolutely trivializing like real addictions, like real physiological addictions with tolerance withdrawal. I mean, you can see people, particularly with the opioid epidemic, that were not junkies. They had no intention of abusing a substance. They just wanted relief from their pain. They were told that this was safe and effective, and now they have an opiate addiction that they never wanted to get high. And that's the real power of like a real physiological, addiction. And saying that like kids' use of smartphones is the same thing is absolutely trivializing that. And that's unfortunate, particularly for people that have experienced a lot of stigma and a lot of disinterest in their well-being for decades. So it's not really helping them either.
Definitely not. Well, Chris, as we wrap things up, is there anything you'd like to leave people with?
Yeah, I think it's just important to remember that, we've been through this before so many times, like I said, with video games, Dungeons and Dragons, Ozzy Osbourne, radio, way back, people used to worry about real books, back at like 150 years ago. It was Anthony Comstock, the Postmaster General, talked about like books as being this toxic sword aimed at the hearts of young children and this kind of stuff. So it's not that we shouldn't take like technology seriously. Maybe there are some real risks around some of these things, but we also should have like our foot on ground somewhere and recognize that we tend to exaggerate our concerns about new technology and hopefully learn from the past.
Definitely. I agree. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me on today. I do appreciate it.
That was it for the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. I'll see you next time.